Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Public Health Institute's first ever Google Hangout. I'm Jenny Miller with the Center for Climate Change and Health at Public Health Institute, where we work to address the impacts of climate change on health and work to promote strategies that mitigate and adapt to climate change while also offering co-benefits to health. Today, we're fortunate to be hosting a conversation between PHI President and CEO Mary Pittman and Linda Marsa, author of the book Fevered: How a Hotter Planet Will Hurt Our Health and How We Can Save Ourselves. Mary Pittman is a nationally recognized leader in improving community health, addressing health inequities among vulnerable people, and promoting quality of care. Pittman became the organization's second president and CEO in 2008. Under Pittman's leadership, PHI has emphasized the integration of new technologies in public health and healthcare, increasing advocacy for public policy and health reform, addressing health workforce shortages, and the impacts of climate change on health. Linda Marsa is an award-winning Los Angeles-based investigative journalist, author, and teacher specializing in science, medicine, and health. Currently a contributing editor at Discover magazine, she has written on a wide range of topics, from the crisis in the nation's emergency rooms, the dangers of prescription drugs, the holes in the food safety net, and the middle-class uninsured, to environmental toxins and the scientists behind the headlines. We'll be live tweeting today's event, and you can follow us on hashtag PHI Fevered. So, Mary, to start the conversation, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how and why PHI has increased its focus on climate change under your leadership.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and I want to thank Linda for joining us on today's Google Hangout. It's so clear that climate change is the #1 public health policy and program priority that we should be addressing. All of the data shows that we have a very short time frame for which we can actually implement policies that will begin to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change that we won't be able to do anything about without some very urgent efforts. So the Public Health Institute takes a very broad perspective of what has an impact on health, and this so clearly has an impact on health. We felt that it was important for us to take a leadership role in lifting up these particular issues. I'd now like to thank Linda and ask her if she would tell us why, as a health and medical journalist, she decided to focus on climate change, which is an issue that most people think of as an environmental issue. And also, why, Linda, did you focus your book mainly on the United States?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and also talk specifically to this audience. As a journalist, I live in the world, and I was reading about climate change, and I wanted to write about it, but there's a lot of really excellent environmental journalists out there, and I really didn't see what I could contribute. But then in 2009, there was a report in The Lancet, the very esteemed British medical journal, that talked about climate change being the #1 public health threat of the 21st century, and that gave me just an incredible pause. And I interviewed the chief author of that report, Anthony Costello, who's this wonderful public health doctor in Great Britain, who's done this incredible work throughout the developing world. And in interviewing him, I really started to see the contours of how that was going to impact us in the rise of infectious diseases, the aftermath of disasters. At that time we saw the flooding in Bangladesh and in the Southeast Asia. So that was the genesis of the book. But the reason that I focused it on the United States is that honestly, I'd like to see people start taking action about this. And when I started writing the book in 2009, no one was talking about climate change. They are now. It's amazing what the difference 5 years makes, but I think we've really reached a inflection point. But when I was doing my research, I discovered that climate change is already affecting our health in this country, and people don't realize it. People are already being affected by climate change.
Well, in some of the areas that PHI works in, we are dealing with the implications of climate change already. For example, with asthma and respiratory health, the effect of heat islands and major urban centers, the impact on agriculture and therefore nutrition. In your research, could you talk a little more about some of the health effects that we're currently seeing from climate change? And what do we anticipate in the future?
Yeah, well, it was just the things that you outlined is that, we are dumping 32 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the air every year. I mean, 1 gigaton is 100 million tons, which is about twice the weight of every single person on this planet. So, my math isn't that good, but we're dumping 60 times the weight of every single person on this planet in carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. As I always say to my husband, what could go wrong? I mean, a lot of things, so we're really starting to have these carbon domes forming over cities. The bad air is getting increasingly worse, and as the temperature goes up, it heats up the particulate matter in the air, so we're having rising rates of asthma. The other piece of this, and this is very recent research that I really didn't touch upon that much in the book, is that this ultrafine particulate matter, and there's more and more of it as we're dumping more of this carbon and as the temperatures heat up, as you breathe it in, there's a growing body of evidence that it causes cognitive impairment and dementia. So this is something that's really new. The other piece of this is that, CO2 obviously is needed for photosynthesis. So when you're, sort of dumping all this extra CO2 in the atmosphere, it's supercharging weeds. So we're getting these super weeds that have, that are giving off pollens that are probably 20 to 30 times as noxious as the pollens that we have now. So we're having longer allergy seasons. So this goes on and on and on and on. The biggest thing that I see, there's the rise of infectious diseases, and we're just starting to see that. But the biggest thing that I see is the impact of extreme weather events. And this is one of those kind of nebulous things, an extreme weather event. But when you're hit with one, you really know it. Hurricanes, flooding, we're going to be seeing a lot more flooding because of rising sea level, storm surges because of that. Even this polar vortex that we just had, there's some indications that, climate change did play a role in that because, we had terrible heat wave up in Alaska and all that Arctic air came down here. Nothing is ever very definitive, but these are the kinds of things that we're going to be seeing is this weather on steroids, and people suffer. Now, I know in your introduction, you talked about, you dealing with the poorest members of society, and unfortunately, they are the people who are going to be affected by climate change first. They're the elderly, the poor who, don't have any place to go, who don't have air conditioning. They're the ones who died during the Chicago heat waves and during the terrible heat waves that we had in Europe, which took 70,000 lives. And they're the ones who suffered the most in the aftermath of these superstorms like Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy. So I think that these are the kinds of things that we're going to be seeing in the future.
So let me take us globally for a minute. And climate change is obviously a global problem. In your book, you reference that simple fixes to clean the air are there are some simple fixes, and you related to the burning of biofuel for cook stoves and the global impact that that has. I think 3 billion people are affected, and it's the second largest contributor to global warming. And it's part of the accelerator for the polar melting. We have been working with the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, and if this is a simple fix, why haven't we solved this problem? And, second, I think that people often feel like the contributions to global warming, for example, from burning biofuel, is off someplace else, and they don't have to worry about it. Can you just talk a little bit about why we should be concerned about problems like that?
Okay, well, the first thing is that we live in a global ecosystem. And, one of the questions I get is, well, California's air is cleaner, things like that, so why should we worry? And I thought, well, you're going to put a dome over California, it sort of affects all of the air. So sort of stepping back, unfortunately, as you know, those 3 billion people that are cooking with cook stoves indoors are poor. So, you know, people don't really pay it that much attention, and there's so many other things that are needed. One of the people who I'm sure you're familiar with, the wonderful, wonderful Kirk Smith, who is over at UC Berkeley, just a sainted man. But he did the studies up in the Guatemalan highlands that really showed the kind of detrimental effects that these cook stoves had. And, you know, and then he said, but no one cared. You know, I mean, they said, look, we've got kids that have got, you know, have no vaccines. They need antibiotics. This sort of comes first. We've got $7 for public health. What are we going to spend it on? And finally, they came up with the cook stove that was $50. I remember visiting him in his office, and he had it sitting on the windowsill. And this prototype cook stove can be given to these women. So there was this seed money, but really it's a matter of money. And the other piece that people don't talk about that much is that, you know, in creating these cooking fires, you have to use wood and kindling, and vast areas of Africa and Latin America are becoming denuded. So you're getting this feedback loop where you have, you know, trees that once were this tremendous carbon sink and absorbing some of the carbon that we keep dumping in the atmosphere. You know, even that is, you know, being removed by this. So I think it really is just a matter of money. And I was very happy about the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. Just got $100 million from the Clinton Global Alliance. So I think that this is finally something that's gaining traction. But it's really an important problem. And I was very surprised to find out that this soot from these cook stoves is the second largest contributor to global warming. I was amazed that it was such a huge greenhouse gas, because you don't hear about it.
Right, right. 3 billion people add up to a lot of carbon. And we're really pleased that we're able to work with CDC and the Global Alliance. Really important issue. Let me take us back to California for a minute. People have been talking about the health impacts of the California drought, and they are very concerning. And you talk a lot about drought and water in your book. Can you describe some of the recommendations from some of the other drought areas that you researched?
Well, let me just step back 1 minute. California's water is really actually very well managed. They're really on top of things. And one of the things that I found, and I think we talked about this a little bit before we went live, is, you know, maybe on a national level or on some of the TV stations, which remain nameless, you know, there's this debate about climate change. But on a local level, there's not. I mean, civic leaders are very responsible. They see what's happening. They're really taking steps to do that. And in California, in Orange County, California is really one of the world leaders in world water management. They have developed this toilet to tap program, which is something we really need to adapt. They take toilet water and they purify it and they use it for tap water. We've got to be recycling, you know, all the water that we use, the gray water, you know, use it for, you know, watering our lawns. You look at Las Vegas, the things that they've done in Las Vegas are remarkable. Las Vegas is a desert city with no water, and they've got, what, 2 million residents. They've got 30 million people coming every year. The kinds of things that they've done in Las Vegas are what we're going to have to do nationally. So there are programs around to deal with water. One of the things that we need to be doing in California, the two things, is we need to do mandatory water conservation. And the second thing, and I know this isn't going to be popular, but it's true, we can't be having crops that require a lot of water, you know, like rice, olives, things like that. We just simply can't. I was very gratified to see that the city of Los Angeles has done a ban on fracking, and the city of Carson has followed suit. And, you know, obviously it's largely symbolic. But I think that it's sending a message that we really can't have fracking in California. We simply don't have the water. Forget the environmental consequences. We simply don't have the water. But there are, I'm actually a lot more optimistic about the water problem, having talked to water managers, because they're really on top of this. The other piece of this is that the desalination programs are starting to come of age. We're seeing technology now that's in the lab that'll be available in the next 4 or 5 years that can really desalinate water in an energy efficient and cost efficient manner. So I'm actually hopeful about water.
Thank you. You write in your book, we must raise the scaffolding of national public health infrastructure that is resilient and able to blunt the disastrous efforts on our health and well-being as climate change intensifies. That particular statement really hit me. And PHI has recently launched a national network of healthcare and public health professionals concerned with climate change and the impact on health, called the U.S. Climate and Health Alliance. What kind of role do you see a group like that playing, and what else could we be doing in the U.S. to really advance some of these great lessons from particular centers such as Orange County and Las Vegas?
Well, I think the first step is informational. As we talked about earlier, one of the things that I found extraordinarily dismaying when I was watching Superstorm Sandy, how that unfolded, is that we didn't learn a lot of the lessons from Hurricane Katrina. The first one is, don't put your backup generators in the basement when you're in a floodplain. That vision of, all of those ambulances lined up outside of NYU Medical Center, one of the #1 top medical centers in the world, having to evacuate in Bellevue in the middle of the storm. That was terribly unnecessary. So I think that there was a lot of lessons that we learned from Hurricane Katrina, a lot of lessons that we learned from Superstorm Sandy that can be disseminated around the country. And I think that that's, the first step is that it can be an informational network. The other piece of this is that, I remember the old story about, Franklin Roosevelt when he was running for re-election in 1936. And some woman came up to him and says, well, I want you to do this, I want you to do that, I want you to do this. And she's going on with this long laundry list of things. And he said, make me do it. And I think that that's the other thing, is that we really have got to mobilize people and make our political leaders take political leadership to do some of the unpopular things that need to be done.
Have you seen any place that's really done an excellent job in mobilizing as a result of one such catastrophe? And what strategy do you suggest that we use to mitigate this response?
Well, unfortunately, I agree with you. You look at what happened after Hurricane Katrina. People were living in trailers, they were displaced, you had much higher rates of alcoholism, suicide. You had five doctors committed suicide in the year after Katrina. The same thing in New York. You had people that were displaced for weeks. You had public health nurses, having to, climb up 12 flights of stairs, finding people in diabetic comas or, in these squalid circumstances because of what's going on. And unfortunately, as you well know, as public health people know, there's been tremendous cutbacks. I think of just one little factoid, is that there's been cutbacks in, in the labs that sort of test for these infectious diseases. Huge cutbacks, I think 90%. So even though we may know the infectious diseases are coming, we can't even test for them. So I think that there really needs to be a concerted effort to put money into this infrastructure that's going to help us guard against some of the things about climate change, which I think we haven't been doing. We haven't been making these investments.
So what gives you the most hope that we can tackle this challenge?
Well, what gives me the most hope is that as I went around the country, I found that even though, maybe at a national level people weren't doing anything, and at a state level people were posturing, on a local level there was a lot of really excellent things that were going on. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, the public health system in New Orleans was demolished. I mean, completely demolished. Only 3 area hospitals were open. That was out of 16. I mean, can you imagine 13 hospitals were closed? They had only 1 level 1 trauma center. And you as public health people know what that means. If somebody had a gunshot wound or something like that, they needed to be airlifted to Shreveport, which is 350 miles away. I don't have to explain to public health people what that means. But what happened was, they were practicing medicine in these storefronts, in these abandoned grocery stores and, department stores. And what ultimately happened is it evolved into a network of 100 clinics within the community, which actually deliver better care than in the public hospitals that are downtown. And they're much more resilient in face of disaster because they all work together. And if one place is flooded out, another place can, take up the slack. So I think that these are, some of the models. In the wake of what happened with Hurricane Katrina, Mayor Bloomberg, former Mayor Bloomberg, and I know the new Mayor de Blasio has been moving on this too, they issued about 250 initiatives in order to get the city more ready for climate change, make nursing homes, new building codes for nursing homes, et cetera, et cetera. So they're really taking this stuff seriously. The other piece of this I mentioned is that the CDC has been beefing up its surveillance network. In cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, you have much better early warning systems for heat waves. During the heat wave in Chicago in 1995, almost 800 people died. 3,500 people were severely debilitated because they didn't know what to do. They were sort of hit flat-footed, but now we know what to do when a heat wave hits. And, the same thing happened in Europe in 2003. Almost 70,000 people died. I mean, there's a debate whether it's 30 to 70, but still, a lot of people died because they didn't have the apparatus. We have that now, so it makes me hopeful. The other thing is that people asked me, what surprised you when I was writing the book? And what surprised me the most was how green New York City is. I mean, you don't think of New York City as being green, but New York City and places like Vancouver are really the model of where we need to go because they have transportation, an excellent transportation system. You have highly condensed cities that, people travel on foot. So you have lower rates of obesity and lower rates, much smaller carbon footprints. And at the same time, another dividend is you have much more vibrant communities. People have better health because they walk and they're outdoors. So that's what really gives me hope. I always tell this story, but they have all these bicycle lanes in New York City now, and you haven't lived until you've crossed a bicycle lane with an angry New Yorker on a bike bearing down on you. So this is the kind of stuff that gives me hope because, as I always say, where the rubber meets the road, people are taking this very seriously, and there's a lot of programs around the country that are shovel-ready, that can be adopted on a national level, that can help us adapt to climate change.
Well, I think one of the things that's exciting to me and leads me to be hopeful is the fact that public health is now engaged in a health and all policy strategy where we're seeing those different silos of governmental agencies and nonprofits and businesses come together to do some of the modeling that you were talking about in New York and other cities where we're looking at housing and transit coming together, looking at new ways that urban planning takes place to make sure that we have complete streets and we're having safe routes for children to walk to school, urban farms, all sorts of things like that. And in your book, you had some really great examples from Australia and how they are adapting to a warmer world and water insecurity. Are there some lessons that we should be learning from other countries and trying to adapt to the U.S. environment as well?
Yeah, well, and and again, that was one of the things that I found very gratifying is that in the United States, people are reaching out. I always say there's sort of a land bridge now between Sydney and Los Angeles, because every time I go to some kind of water summit out here, there's always a bunch of Australians there. And the Australians, by necessity, have become the world leaders in water management. They had a drought for about 11 years that ended, 12 years, excuse me, that ended in 2011. And Australia is just a big flat desert island, and it really doesn't have that much water. So the kind of water management things that they're doing in Australia are things that we need to adopt for the rest of the world. I was just in, as I mentioned, North Carolina on an environmental fellowship by the Institute of Journalism and Natural Resources. A little plug for them. They were really quite wonderful. But, I was talking to, obviously they're very vulnerable to sea level rise, and I said, are you working with the Dutch? And they said, the Dutch are our new best friends, because who else knows how to control sea level rise better than the Dutch? So I see all of this stuff going on. The thing that does dismay me is that we are in denial about sea level rise. I spent time on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and I really understand. These people have lived there for hundreds of years. I mean, that area has been settled since the 19th century, and they don't want to move. But the fact is that those barrier islands are going to be underwater in the next 50 years. So that's one of the things that I do see, is that there's some denial about what really needs to be done. Should we have rebuilt New Orleans? There's a lot of questions about that. What about Florida? So on and on and on. But on the whole, I was very pessimistic when I started writing the book because no one was talking about climate change. But when I got done, I felt a lot more optimistic that people are out there that know what they're doing, that know what's happening, and are really grappling with the issue in a positive way.
Well, you gave a plug. I want to give a plug. This is your book.
Thank you.
It certainly was a great read. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I encourage other people who, depending on their level of knowledge about climate change, should take the time to read Fevered. Any last things you'd like to share with our audience today, or any thoughts that you have?
Well, people always ask me what people need to do, because I think that's where we're at right now. People recognize climate change is happening, but they don't know what to do. And I tell people, and I'm a journalist, and I'm not supposed to, but it's the truth, you've got to get active. You have to be active in your communities. We have to push our political leaders to take leadership on this issue. The greenest communities have the most active citizenry. It was, the third law of thermodynamics, day follows night, whatever, cliche that you want to use. But, in the words of the great Carl Sagan, the great late Carl Sagan, we can't sit this one out.
Thank you so much. And I know one of the things that we work on is environmental tracking, and it's a program that is vulnerable in funding every time it comes up. It is so important. We'll be active in making sure that the data continues to be there so that we can monitor these impacts. And we're excited about working with local communities to try to spread some of the knowledge that you've outlined in your book, and also continue to work with our alliance in the center to make sure that individuals do have some ideas of how they can be active. And Linda, we look forward to having a follow-up conversation with you and keep this dialogue going. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for taking the time this morning with us. And for those of you who want to go run out and pick up the book and learn a lot more about climate change, Fevered is available in bookstores and online. And if you'd like to learn more about PHI's work on climate change, you can visit us on the web at climatehealthconnect.org and follow us on Twitter at climatehealthcx. So again, thank you, and more to come.
All right, thank you.